Welcome to the Criminal Imagination. This series, Crime and Civilization, begins with a simple question. What if the true purpose of law is not justice but control? Across centuries, crime fiction has recorded the political fears of its age, from cursed kings and cunning thieves to corrupt judges and silent witnesses. Each episode investigates how power operates through narrative, what it hides, who it condemns, and what happens when the system turns inwards and begins to devour itself. What if the most terrifying prison wasn't made of walls or iron bars, but of thought, of fear, of knowledge? What if the state didn't need to sentence you because you would do it to yourself? William Godwin's Caleb Williams is not merely a Gothic novel or a revolutionary tract, or even the first psychological thriller in English literature. It is a dissection of how the modern state infiltrates the soul. In this episode of Crime and Civilization, we explore how Caleb Williams captures one of the earliest and most chilling portraits of internalized justice, how the state creates guilt not through punishment but through persistent psychological pressure. At the center of it is a young man who, in trying to expose the truth, loses everything, including himself. Let's begin. Published in 1794, Things as They Are, or The Adventures of Caleb Williams, appears at a moment of profound political volatility. The French Revolution has shaken the old world, and the English government responds with paranoia, surveillance, and repression. Godwin himself is a philosopher of radical reform committed to liberty, reason, and the abolition of tyranny. But unlike other Enlightenment thinkers, Godwin is deeply aware of how power operates, not just through armies or monarchs, but through institutions, rituals, social codes, and fear. Caleb Williams tells the story of a young servant, intellectually curious and morally earnest, who stumbles upon a secret. His aristocratic employer, Falkland, is a murderer. But rather than confessing or allowing justice to proceed, Falkland traps Caleb in a web of gaslighting, psychological warfare, and institutional persecution. Caleb is never charged, never convicted, and yet he is hunted, discredited, and ruined. And here lies the genius of Goodwin's insight. The law doesn't need to kill Caleb, it only needs to make him believe he is guilty. The modern state, Godwin suggests, governs not just through laws but through the invisible pressures that makes us punish ourselves. At the start of the novel, Caleb is a figure of enlightenment optimism. He is rational, curious, and principled. He believes in justice, truth, reason. He enters Falkland's service not out of submission but fascination. Falkland is cultured, noble, mysterious, a romantic figure from a Byronic sketch. But Caleb's intellectual instincts, his desire to know and understand, soon draw him into dangerous territory. The first pivot in Caleb's psychological descent comes not from discovering Falkland's guilt, but from what happens after that discovery. The truth, instead of setting him free, becomes a source of unbearable tension. Falkland never denies the accusation, he merely exerts power, subtly, relentlessly, and without recourse. He tells Caleb essentially, "You know, and I know you know, but you cannot speak, and if you do, I will destroy you." Caleb becomes caught in a silent war of attrition. He is not jailed but watched, not executed but shamed. Every glance, every silence, every institutional obstacle reminds him that power does not need to roar to be lethal, it need only whisper. What follows is a sustained unraveling. Caleb flees, is pursued, is turned away, is falsely accused, is imprisoned, escapes and falls again. But these external plot movements pale in comparison to the internal deterioration. As readers, we witness a harrowing transformation. Caleb, once a voice of rational clarity, begins to narrate with anxiety, self doubt, and fragmentation. He becomes paranoid. He questions the loyalty of strangers. He imagines betrayal in every glance. He hallucinates motives, drowns in moral ambiguity, and finds no sanctuary, not even in his own mind. There is no longer just a story about state injustice. It is a story about what happens when the self is broken, when the soul internalizes punishment so deeply that it becomes its own executioner. But what is Caleb's actual crime? He does not kill, he does not steal, he does not defraud or betray. His only sin is to know. Godwin structures the novel around the central ethical dilemma. Is it worse to know the truth and be destroyed, or to live with a lie and be complicit? Caleb is haunted not just by Falkland's crime, but by his own knowledge of it. He is torn between silence, an act of moral cowardice, and speech, an act that might ruin a man, challenge an entire system, and annihilate his own life. This paradox lies at the heart of Godwin's critique. In a society built on hierarchy and power, truth becomes treason. Justice is not a universal principle but a performance maintained by secrecy, ritual, and fear. Caleb's mere act of knowing destabilizes the facade. His punishment is not administered by any one institution, but by the system as a whole. We begin to see how the state functions not just legally, but also psychically. It produces subjects who police themselves. It produces people like Caleb who hesitate to act not because they lack courage, but because they are forced into a condition where all choices lead to ruin. Speak and you are destroyed. Remain silent and you are complicit. This is the fundamental logic of psychological policing. It replaces the gallows with ambivalence, punishment with internal collapse. There is something deeply modern about Caleb's guilt. He begins to behave as though he has committed a crime. He apologizes for disturbing others. He suspects that misfortune is his fault. He fears that simply by being present he becomes or he brings danger. Godwin anticipates a form of guilt that is not tied to action but to existence. Caleb doesn't do wrong, he is wrong. In the eyes of the state, the person who knows, who asks, who refuses to forget, is already dangerous. This resonates with what modern theorists like Michael Foucault would call disciplinary power. It is not a sovereign power that demands obedience through violence. It is a diffuse, quiet force that molds subjects through fear, guilt, and normalization. Caleb's mind becomes the new courtroom. His guilt is not a verdict, it is a feeling. And that feeling, once planted, needs no judge. He becomes his own captor. Even when Caleb escapes literal prison, he remains mentally bound. He cannot restore his reputation. He cannot sleep. He cannot trust. His spirit remains in a state of hypervigilance. He is a man permanently alert to the state's gaze, even when alone. Godwin's psychological insight is extraordinary. Long before Freud, he understands that persecution is not simply external. It works through dreams, paranoia, silence, and memory. Caleb's narration becomes more erratic. He confesses to the reader not out of confidence but desperation. His thoughts return again and again to the same moral dilemma, reliving his choices, trying to decipher whether he did it right or wrong, but there is no resolution. The novel ends not with a triumph but with a confession of irreversible damage. Caleb finally exposes Falkland, but instead of being vindicated, he is shattered. Falkland dies, and Caleb, rather than feeling relief, feels remorse. He wonders if perhaps his desire for justice was tainted by revenge. He considers whether truth in the end was worth the cost. This collapse of ethical certainty is itself a form of punishment. Godwin presents a character who, even after doing what is right, cannot recover a sense of peace. Caleb is not a revolutionary hero. He's a ghost. This is perhaps the darkest message of the novel. Even victory doesn't free you. One of the most striking features of Caleb Williams is that the state is barely visible. There is no tyrannical monarch, no grand tribunal, no explicit execution. And yet, the machinery of surveillance and repression is everywhere, in gossip, in suspicion, in the impossibility of finding work, in the reluctance of strangers to help a man whose name is tainted. This is the modern state in its most refined form, not as a brute force but as an invisible infrastructure, a network of information, whispers, moral codes, and institutional alliances that ensures dissenters are crushed without a single drop of blood. The horror of Caleb's fate is that he's never formally punished, but he is systematically erased. His friends disappear, his reputation is shattered, even his internal compass, once stable and clear, begins to disintegrate. And this makes Godwin's critique more radical than any call for revolution. It is a warning about how power colonizes the mind. In Caleb Williams, Godwin invents a new kind of crime fiction, one where the greatest crimes are abstract, where the villains are not individuals but structures, and where the most enduring violence is not physical but psychological. Caleb's journey is not that of a wronged man seeking justice. It is the journey of a subject caught between two impossible options: betrayal of the truth or destruction of the self. He chooses the truth and pays the price. But Godwin is not merely asking us to pity Caleb, he is asking us to see something far more unsettling: that in a world governed by power, hierarchy, and surveillance, knowing too much is a liability, and justice, when it collides with order, becomes not a virtue but a threat. The true horror of Caleb Williams is not the murder or the chase or the prison. It is the realization that a rational, moral man can be broken not by violence but by the invisible pressures of the modern state. Thank you for joining us on this episode. And before I leave, here is a question for you: is it a crime to seek truth, or only a crime when that truth threatens the power that defines what crime is? If you found this exploration of Caleb Williams compelling, subscribe for more deep dives into how crime fiction reflects the political architecture of our world, from monarchy to capitalism, surveillance to policing, media to revolution. Until next time, remember, the crime is not always in the act, sometimes it is in the knowing, and the punishment, it's not always in the chains. Sometimes the quiet collapse of the self is what the punishment is.